What's up, everyone? Welcome to today's daily market recap. In today's episode, I'm going to break down all of my trades from the morning. I'm sitting in the green, pleasantly surprised. I kind of made up for the fact that yesterday was a smaller green day. And, I'll say that I came in with a little bit of a feeling that I had to make up for yesterday. Yesterday was a smaller green day, and it was actually the smallest green day of the month. And I kind of had this, aggressive monthly goal. And I have been maintaining a very high daily average this month. And then yesterday brought that average way back down. So there was a part of me that was like, to get that average back up, I'm going to need to not only have a good day today, I'm going to need to have a really great day, like a fantastic day, like almost 2 times a regular green day. And it ended up happening. Now, the way it happened was sort of slowly through the accumulation of a number of just solid trades. I did have a couple of bigger losses today, same as yesterday. Biggest loss yesterday was $5,000, which at that point was my biggest loss of the entire month. I also had a $5,000 loss today. However, at the time that I had that loss, I was already in such a good place on the day that I was able to sustain the loss. It wasn't a big deal, continue trading. And at this point, I made it back and I finished basically at my peak, at my high a day, which on the one hand means maybe I'm leaving money on the table. Because usually I say every day you're doing one of two things. You're leaving money on the table or you're giving back profit. So since I'm walking away right now at my high a day, I may be leaving some money on the table, but I'm okay with that because I'm walking away, of course, with profit in my pocket. So let's go ahead and jump onto the screen share. I'm going to start breaking it down. We do have a lot to cover, but I have a limited amount of time because I'm going to be jumping on a plane and heading back home. So let's start with first trade of the day, XHG. And actually, we'll talk a little bit about this shift in momentum that occurred between, well, I guess yesterday and today. Or Friday and Monday. So last week, we were seeing a lot of momentum in this on the catalyst of, a private placement to use the money to buy cryptocurrency. So UPXI was one of the first ones that had this catalyst that gave us also a really big move. This was back on April 21st when it squeezed from less than $4 a share to over $20. A huge move. Pulls back and then 2 days later makes a new high. So that was the beginning of that cycle. And it continued for a few weeks. So we were still seeing it happening last week, similar headlines. Friday, similar headlines. And then yesterday, we began to see a little bit of a shift. So KDLY was the stock that made a big move yesterday. And it did have that crypto catalyst, crypto Bitcoin treasury. And I was really frustrated on this one, if you could tell from my recap yesterday, because I felt like number one, I was annoyed that it made this big move, and then 10 minutes later, the news came out. Because that told me that someone had the news before it was released. So that was annoying. If we all get the news at the same time, then we all have the same chance at trading it. But if, some people get the news first because it's not actually released yet, well, then that's kind of not fair. So that I was a little frustrated about that. And I just felt like I was kind of behind the ball the whole time I was trying to trade it because I missed the beginning and then I was just sort of chasing it. And I made some money on it, but I was never really able to get myself in the driver's seat. And then, of course, but it made a huge move. So I wasn't feeling great about that. But then as the day went on, we ended up seeing a shift where a lot of the stocks that started to squeeze up were Chinese. Now, that makes sense because of this 90-day pause with the tariffs with Chinese companies. So if we kind of, go back to when this trade war began with China, all of a sudden we saw this renewed interest for investing in domestic companies, U.S. companies, right? These rare earth companies that make these minerals or whatever they are here in the United States instead of overseas. So a lot of domestic companies were getting this surge of attention. And now that we have this 90-day pause on the trade war, you're seeing that these Chinese companies are back in play. The problem with a lot of these Chinese companies, as we well know from years of trading them,
is that a lot of these companies some of them are shell companies. They're really not used for anything. It's not a real company. It's just a vehicle essentially for extracting profits from US investors on the US market. And so for that reason, we always have to approach these Chinese companies with skepticism and a bit of caution. Can there be opportunities to make money trading them? Yes, there certainly can be. You could also just as easily, for what it's worth, lose trading just US companies. So it's not that avoiding Chinese companies will necessarily make you more successful. In fact, it might make you less successful because you would miss out on the volatility that is present there. But nonetheless, for me, when I see that we're getting this big momentum in these Chinese names, I'm interested, but I'm also approaching it with some skepticism and caution. So as I sat down this morning, so I looked at the scans yesterday, and of course I saw that, I had missed some moves and felt like I left some money on the table yesterday. So I was a bit annoyed about that. But I sat down this morning, and the first couple stocks I looked at on the scans, UPC, Chinese. All right, so this stock goes from $4 to $9 and then back down to 5. All right, so I'm like, okay, we're already seeing some rejections, but it had no news. Well, unless you consider the fact that it was Chinese news, but that's not really news. That's just the current kind of state. So then, and then Wafu. Wafu was another one, Chinese company, pops up and rejects, but there was no news. So I'm thinking, okay, there were a bunch of charts like this morning, but LOBO was a stock that had made a big move starting at about, I don't know what time it was. It was like 5 a.m. It squeezes from $1 all the way up to $3.50. And it pulled back. And as I sat down at 7 a.m., I was like, okay, this is a maybe. It popped up, pulled back. This was definitely the front side of the move, right in there. But if it curls back up, maybe there's another leg higher, potentially. It's very thickly traded, so might be a little congested, but worth watching. As it turned out, at 7 a.m., it rolled over, and so I never ended up trading it. Then we had LICN. LICN, another Chinese name, popped up, no news, began the move yesterday, right? Popped up, dropped down, squeezes up, and then sort of starts rolling over going at 7 a.m. So another one that's no good. No trades on that one. And then we had, let's see, there were a few others, but then XHG hits the scanners, and lo and behold, here we have another Chinese company. Now, this one, you got to pull up the address. This is actually very interesting that they do this. A lot of these have number 801, building 1, Shanghai, USA, US. And that is not United States. So just FYI, sometimes these will, and I don't know if it's intentional, but sometimes they will appear to be a US company, but they're actually not because of their address. So in any case, XHG starts squeezing up from $2, $2.20, $2.30, $2.40. So I looked at this and I was like, I don't know, guys. I don't know what to think. I mean, it's a low price stock. Can I, it's the right flow. It's between $2 and $10. It's moving, but there's no clear catalyst. So I pulled up the chart, and what you'll see happened on this was basically it squeezes up right here, pops up to a high really quickly of about 360. Okay. Then it drops down, and notice the volume profile, higher volume selling. So I look at that and I'm like, I'm going to give you a pop quiz. Pop quiz. Is this a pattern that you should trade? We've got a stock that just hit our scanners. It's squeezed up and is now selling off. You've got a topping tail, that high upper candle wick, 1, 2 topping tails, and you've got high volume selling. Yes, the MACD is positive, but the volume profile says, no, we should not trade this pattern. So what ends up happening? It ends up working. Why? Because it's Chinese, and the Chinese stocks don't follow the rules. It's as simple as that. It doesn't make sense, but it goes higher. So this can be very frustrating for traders that really focus on following the rules of technical analysis, because the rules sometimes don't apply. Now, I say they don't apply. I mean, they do, but they don't. In the case of something like GameStop, that goes higher and higher and higher. You could argue that, it was very extended and shouldn't have kept going that higher. And fundamental analysis would have backed that up as well. But, it just kept going because shorts were getting squeezed out, and maybe long bias momentum traders were just jumping on to ride the momentum. So with XHG, essentially that's what you got today. You got a stock that didn't make sense, but it went higher. So I took my first entry buying it as it squeezed through the high here for a small scalp. Basically, I jumped in for the break through the high, knowing it was risky, but I jumped in at 360 and it squeezed up to 420. And on that first trade right there, I made $5,000. And that was a good trade. I'm not complaining. It was a decent little trade. It pulls back right here, and now we get another 1 minute pullback, and I take that trade for the next leg higher. So that didn't go as high as I would have liked, but it was a small win. Then it ends up pulling back and coming into 7 a.m., does another squeeze back up. But at that point, I wasn't really sure about it because it broke below the volume weighted average price. Then it ripped back up, but it happened so quickly, I just felt like I couldn't manage risk on it. So I didn't take any more trades on XHG. That was all I did, $5,527.69. All right, so, and here's my P&L for the day, by the way. So that's where I sit on the day. So smallest winner was XHG. That was the first stock I traded, but that was good because that broke the ice, gave me a cushion, and then I was ready to look for something else. And at that point, CNSP popped up and hit our scanners. Now, CNSP is a little bit different because CNSP actually had what I would call a valid catalyst. This is a pharmaceutical company. We've traded it before, and it had news that came out. Now, what's interesting is they acquire orphan drug designation for this treatment that they're working on, but then just 2.5 hours later, they announced a $5 million public offering. So they sold shares on the open market, basically into that squeeze, which is a little sketchy, but it happens. These companies often need to raise money, and they have shelf registration, so they've notified shareholders of their intent to raise money. So how did I trade this one? Well, CNSP hit my scanner, started to squeeze up from $1.40, $1.50, $1.60, $1.70, all the way up to $2. Micro pullback right there. I jumped in right there at $2.22. It ends up squeezing up to a high of $2.80, $2.90, $3, all the way up to $3.20. Jumped in, jumped out of that, $10,000. So now I'm up $15,000 on the day. Nice. Can't complain about that. All right. So then the next stock I traded after CNSP was ALZN. ALZN, this is a pop and drop. However, it had news. So that's where this was a little confusing. It's a biotech stock like CNSP. It had news. And so I jumped on this. And this one moved very quickly. So we'll pull up a 10-second chart for this one. So on this one, it squeezes from 6 all the way up to a high of 7, pulls back, goes up to 8, dips down, and I got in it was right here. My first entry was $9.57 right here for the break of 10. It goes up to 10, it goes up to 11. So I jumped in, jumped out of that. Then we get first 1 minute candle to make a new high right here and a double top up there. I was hoping it would break. It didn't, but was still able to capture profit. It starts to pull back. So now I'm waiting on a 1 minute setup. We don't end up getting it. It ends up pulling back and doing a round trip. So that was a little bit disappointing, but I was able to capture some profit out of that move. Then we sort of had a lull where I didn't have any trades for a few minutes until HCWB popped up on the scanners. Now, HCWB ends up being the stock that I made the most on today. It's currently halted. It's been very volatile, as you can see. It hit the scanners down at about $5 a share and hit a high today of over $16. It's incredible. So when it first pops up and hits our scanners, it hits the scanner right here, and I'm like, okay, that's obviously an incredible move. It went from $5 to $10, and then it came all the way back down. So I was like, yeah, I don't know. It's sort of not sure I can trust it. And then it curls back up right here. As it curled back up right here, I said, this is that curling pattern, and I know that this can work really well. So I jumped in with a starter of 1,500 shares at $9.85 to anticipate the breakthrough 10, and I doubled at 10 and added at 10.15. So 4,500 shares, and it squeezes from 10 all the way up to 1150. About $5,000 of profit on that trade right there. And then it dips down right here, and I bought these dips off of $10. Previous resistance becomes support, and it rips back up to 11, 1150, 12, all the way to $13 a share. Unbelievable. What a fantastic squeeze. So now I'm really getting in the driver's seat on this stock, and I'm actively trading it. So I got some nice trades here between 9 and 10, 11, 12, $13 a share. And then it starts to pull back. So we'll switch to the 1-minute chart. So it hits this high here of 13.26, and I got some good profit on that. And then it dips down. It tries to curl right here back over VWAP, and then it rejects again. And then it comes up right here, and I got back in right here for the break over VWAP. And at that spot, it broke VWAP and it began to push higher. Now, what was interesting on this was, where was it? Let's see. Now I can't remember where it was. I think it was it right in, it might have been right in here. When I first took this trade, it popped up, it dipped down, and at $9, there was a 15,000 share buyer. And I watched that buyer accumulate shares. People were selling to them at 9. They were sitting on the bid at 9, and people were selling. And so I said, you know what? And this person bought 15,000 shares, and it drops down for a second. And I said, I'm going to jump in right here with 4,500 shares. This person has the confidence to buy 15,000 shares here. I'm basically going to kind of piggyback on that, because they've got a high degree of confidence. Good for them. So I went ahead and jumped in there at 9, and we got the squeeze almost immediately up to 10, 11, and then higher. So as it rallies up into the open right here, I was actively trading it. And then right here for the break of 14, we got this final squeeze up to a high of 16. And it was just beautiful. I mean, that was just an awesome trade. Now, I did have my $5,000 loss that I had a little bit later in the morning was on this stock. There were a couple of false attempts up here around 1150. So we had this sort of topping tail, this one here, this rejection here. And I kept trying to time that break through 1150. Oops, I closed my window. I'll have to reload that. So I ended up struggling a little bit with it. And one of the challenges with it, kind of like KNDY from yesterday, or KDLY from yesterday, was that we had bigger spreads. And so with those bigger spreads, it can be more difficult to manage risk. And that was certainly the case on that. Just as it got more expensive, it became more and more difficult to manage risk. So that was kind of the challenge that I was facing on HCWB. As it went higher, I would jump in, and then suddenly it would flush. Now, yesterday at the open, KDLY ended up selling off at the open. So I was a little cautious about that risk happening again today, like a huge move pre-market and then a sell-off at the open. And sure enough, at the open, what happens? The spreads got bigger. So now, as a result of market makers, we saw bigger spreads, and then we saw this really dramatic rejection up to 16, and then slams down into a halt, and then drops again even more. And then it rallies back up, halts twice, and now halting down again. So now we're seeing volatility, but not in a way that feels manageable for managing risk. So HCWB gives us this huge move. And basically the setup on this was pop, pull back, curl, and then squeeze, and then pull back and then curl. So the next stock I traded, this one ended up being kind of a surprise. So on Verb, this stock hit our scanners earlier in the morning right here at about 8:35 and then pulled back. And at the time, it had made a pretty big move from $6 up to $8. So I was like, yeah, that's pretty impressive. So right here, you see this candle at 9:03 where it squeezed from 7 all the way up to $11 a share, which is, it's kind of unreal. So here's what I did. I had this chart. I had this on a side chart, Verb, and I had HCWB on my main chart. And I saw Verb, and I had it up on my level 2, and I'd been kind of watching the spread on it. So at one point, right about here, I almost jumped in. The spread was something like 650 or 660 by 680, and I was like, okay, are we gonna go? Is this gonna break? but then it didn't. And I was like, oh, okay, all right, well, whatever. So then it kind of keeps going sideways, but I kept having that level 2 up. So when I'm watching a stock, basically I'm watching 2 level 2 windows. So right here, I have it set up for CNSP. But I have 2 that are side by side. So even though I'm trading this one, I still have this one on my side chart. So I had Verb on the side chart right here. And all of a sudden I saw the spread kind of tighten up just like it just did there. And then you start to see some green going through on the time and sales. And I was like, okay, here we go. Now, I'll say this was a little bit like the BAOS trade yesterday that I lost on, in that I was sort of thinking that this was going to give us a squeeze because it was similar to HCWB, but BAOS did not. It popped up, there was a big seller, and it rejected. So on this one, it starts to pop up, and I put out 3 orders. I get a full order filled on my first order, and I fill only 679 shares on my second and only like 1,200 on my third. So I get partial fills. So getting partial fills means that even though I had an offset of 10 cents on my order, the price moved so quickly that it jumped over my order. So now my buy orders are sitting basically on the bid, waiting for someone to come and sell me shares. And no one was selling me shares. There were no sellers, there were only buyers. So then I have a partial fill, and I'm thinking, all right, well, it's moving. So on the one hand, that's good, because if I filled all of my orders, then that would tell me I'm buying in a way from a hidden seller, because there's someone selling maybe more than what was visible on the level 2. So anyways, I get a partial fill, and then it squeezes up, and I add for the break through the high, which the high a day was 750. So then I add 746, 751 for the break of the high, and it goes up to $8 a share. And I'm like, okay, great, $8 a share. That's a fantastic, right there is a pretty good trade. And so it's $8 on the ask, and I decided, you know what, I'm going to add at 8 because this is strong, and now I've got a cushion, so let's just see what this does. And all of a sudden, on the bid is 915. So all of a sudden, it goes from 8 was on the ask, to $9.15 on the bid. So now there's a big bid sitting at 915. And I'm like, well, wait a second. This is wild. So I end up selling a little bit at 928. And then when I realize that bid is holding, I add back at 935, and it goes up to a high of 10, 1050, 11, and hits a high of 1188. And so essentially what we got here was a algo spike. So what ends up happening is when all of these buy orders come in, the market makers who are making the market, they sit on both the bid and the offer. If all of a sudden there's a surge of buying and they're sitting on the offer with a sell order for, let's say, 50,000 shares, and they don't cancel and move that order up, they could inadvertently become short 50,000 shares as a stock is spiking. So what it ends up happening is in real time, these market makers, they're consuming market data. And when they see these surges of buying and selling, they move their orders to make sure they don't inadvertently short a stock that's spiking or buy a huge position on a stock that's dropping. And so what ends up happening is these market makers kind of feed off of each other, where all of a sudden they're pulling their orders. And then suddenly the spreads are getting bigger because the orders are getting moved out. And then anyone who's maybe short, who's trying to cover, in order to buy back shares to cover, they're having to buy back at a higher and higher price. And each time they press the buy button, they're only fueling that algorithm to see more buy orders coming in. And so you get these really extended moves. And I think that's kind of what happened here. And it's not unlike what we've seen happen, in fact, on a number of stocks. What was the one yesterday? Oh, now I'm trying to think of it. So yesterday we had that stock that went from about 50 cents a share to $5 on an algo spike. I don't think I'm going to be able to think of it off the top of my head. Let me just see if it's on the continuation scanner. It might still be. No, I'm not seeing it right now, but it's okay. If you watch my recap from yesterday, you'll see that stock. And so anyways, I think that's kind of what happened here. Now, and that's one of the reasons that the curling pattern can be so powerful. The initial spike a lot of traders will trade it, but you also feel like it's hard to manage risk because it's just spiking up so quickly. So more traders lately tend to short these spikes, and then it drops down and they kind of hope it just fades and they cover. But when it curls back up, then suddenly your target's a break through the high, your stop is the consolidation, and then you get that surge and you get that spike. However, we ended up having higher volume selling and it walked it right back down. So I was kind of surprised in a way. I mean, you never expect to get $5 a share or $3 a share, whatever it is, on a trade. So that break of, that initial trade right here for the break of 7, adding at 750, adding at 8, and then it goes straight to nearly $12 a share. So it's like 4 points, 5 points. It's like, if you're lucky enough to get a trade and catch that timing right, that's wonderful, but that doesn't happen often. So this was a little bit of a probably anomaly rather than the norm. But in any case, I was grateful for it and then switched right back to HCWB, which I continued trading. And HCWB didn't give us that same degree of spike here, but it certainly did in this area here. So where it went from 5 to 10, very similar algo spike, just instant spike. But then a lot of times these do pull back. But when it came back up a second time, that's exactly, I mean, it's very similar to what we got on Verb. The difference here is that HCWB held up and kept going. And sometimes they will. And Verb didn't. And sometimes they won't. And, this popped up and it pulled back and it probably almost seemed like it was going to be done. And then it opened up for another leg higher. So if you knew with certainty which one would go and which one won't go, you'd be very successful in the market. But like anything else, there's a degree of uncertainty. And so you really have to sort of chalk it up to statistics. And if you trade these certain sets of stocks in a certain price range at a certain time of day with these certain characteristics in terms of it's up this much on the day and it's got this amount of relative volume and this and that, then, if you only trade those setups on that set of stocks and you can maintain accuracy of 60% success, 70%, something like that, then you're going to do well. And you're going to catch enough of them that work that the losers, you make up for the ones that don't work. And that's essentially, what it is. So yeah, and this one may end up continuing higher. I'm not going to overtrade it. I've done well enough on it during a time of day when, for me, it was fairly predictable and the spreads were a bit tighter. I think, those that keep trading it, certainly over 1568. I closed that window again. I was trying to get my drawing tool out, but anyways, so it's good to see. It's good to see this momentum. HCWB right here coming up to this halt level 1614. I'd love to see it continue higher. I don't know if it will, but in any case, I feel very grateful for the day. I certainly made up for the fact that yesterday was a slower day. So now the average between yesterday and today is very high. And so my daily average continues to be very high for the month of May. And what I said this morning early on when I was streaming is I said, guys, remember, right now the market is very volatile. This is a time you should definitely be practicing in the simulator if you are new. We're going to see big whips. We're going to see some algo spikes. We're going to see some stocks that pop up $5, $10 a share. But if you chase it and you buy the top, you're not going to be happy. And if you're shorting it with real money, you could also get really into a bad position. So manage your risk and practice right now in a simulator. If you're someone who's already been trading for 6 months or a year or longer, then you've paid your dues. And this is the time when you're hopefully able to extract some nice profit from the market. But for those of you guys who are brand new, you've got to pay your dues first. Remember, slow and steady. So I don't want you guys trying to blindly follow me, or you shouldn't do it for anyone else. I know some people will tell you to do it. I discourage that. I think instead, when you're in my chat room, it's a classroom. It's an interactive classroom where I'm putting the strategies I trade every day on display. So you can see demonstrations of what you're learning. And look at that drop we just saw in the level 2 from 16 all the way down to like 1480, 1479. These are big swings. So please manage your risk, take it slow. But for those of you guys that want to continue learning, I'll put links to a couple of recent uploads right here, here, and here that you guys should check out. And as always, the link to the 2-week trial is posted in the top of the comments and in the description. So with that, I will see you guys
bright and early tomorrow morning.